both Anna and Rachel. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Info MOOC. Tonight is Session 3, Compare, Contrast, and Classification. I'm Cheryl Ord, and I am a kindergarten through 7th grade science teacher at a small charter school in Nampa, Idaho.
Thanks, Cheryl. I'm Michael Lauer. I teach life science at the 7th grade level at Heritage Middle School in Meridian, Idaho. Before we get started, we just want to mention real quick, if you find yourself experiencing any tech difficulty, we have found that Safari and Chrome are the browsers that work the best. So if you're getting any sort of issues, you might try doing that. And of course, we'll be archived, so if you have any difficulties tonight, you can always come back and check this out later. So, hey, welcome to our Info MOOC. We've been talking all about informational text structures. If you're just joining us for the first time, we're now on our 3rd session. So our first unit, we talked about listing and summarizing, and that's on our website archived, so people can go back and check that out and see examples. Our last session was description and definition, which was really good. Cheryl, how about tonight and then 2 weeks from now? What are we doing?
So tonight, like I said, we're going to be talking about exploring compare and contrast and classification and how they work together and all the text structures previous to them work in service of those. And then in 2 weeks, Anna Daly and I will be talking about problem solution and cause and effect. And it'll be really great because we're going to go back and kind of show what Anna has been learning for her podcast that she's been working on, and then I'm going to talk about some things in my classroom. So it'll be great.
All right, great. And one more thing before we get started. We have done a lot of thinking about informational text, and we've drawn a lot of ideas from the book Get It Done. Right. So this is also on the website if you're interested in a great resource that has crux moves, strategies, common core tie-ins, lesson ideas, all sorts of really good stuff that we have found super helpful in thinking about this. So tonight we really want to frame our work under a essential question we think is important, and how can we use comparing, contrasting, and classification to create a sense of order and facilitate deep understanding. And I think if we're going to do that, why in the world are we even talking about comparing and contrast? So why is it so powerful? And I think there's a couple things that are really important just to mention right off the bat, is that comparing and contrasting items to each other allows us to make meaning. So we compare familiar things to new and unknown things. We compare new situations from past experiences and what might happen in future situations. Right, yeah. And so when do people actually do these things? Cheryl, how about some examples where you use comparing and contrasting?
Yeah, well, I was thinking about it that we do this all the time because at our house, going out to dinner is always a big discussion about which restaurant we go to and who likes what and who doesn't like what. And then even at school, we use it like, sorry, I lost my train of thought. I have been using it with some 1st graders, and we have been reading the book Stella Luna. And in this book, we, yep, I have a little graph of it here.
Great, let's take a look while you're describing.
Okay, so we read the book Stella Luna, and then we read an informational text. And so we created this cool little T-chart, which really is great for the young kids, but also can work at any grade level. And this is for contrasting only. And so we listed the facts that we found in Stella Luna that was true, that we had learned in our informational text, and then we listed fiction on the other side. And so the kids had a great time trying to decide what was fiction and what wasn't fiction.
Ah, great. Yeah, like I can think of kids' books I read my little kids that have
right.
things that are sometimes accurate to science and sometimes not. Here's one, because we really want to situate you as teachers as learners and think about not only our professional but our personal lives, but boy, we are hitting that long stretch and spring break is coming up soon. So one thing I started thinking about is I have a group of buddies and we usually get together spring break and we go fishing, and I thought about, hey, where are we going to go fishing? So I used compare and contrast to think about different options of places that we've been, we enjoy fishing, and then to rank those and help us think about what might be the best destination for us this year. So I just wanted to share a quick personal example.
And then, like, I love semantic feature analysis because here's a quick example of how it could be used in math. Comparing and contrasting different types of polygons. And it's great because it's so visual. And then the next one is a quick example of how it can be used in an English classroom with the novel The Outsiders. And I love all that vocabulary across the top, and you can see really obviously what characteristics fit each character.
Yeah, that's great. You know, I can think about it in science. We use it a lot to compare and contrast things. In fact, earlier in the year, we were looking at words, and before we really got started with life science, we said, hey, what is science? What is inquiry? And so we compared and contrasted those words so kids can see, hey, here's the little things they have different from each other, but then here's all these similarities. And then we used the Venn diagram, the overlapping circles, for them to show their thinking and just really help them make sense of these words.
Yeah.
In fact, one other thing that I've noticed is really it doesn't matter what your context, what your subject area, it's really compare and contrast is so powerful and used in every content area. So Cheryl, what does that make you think?
Well, like in science, we're both science teachers, but it applies in all disciplines. In science, there's a million examples. You can compare and contrast body systems. You can compare and contrast organisms. What's the difference? Right now in my class, one of my classes, we're talking about the difference between an atom and a molecule and a compound and an element and a mixture. And
sure. You know, I got thinking about English language arts and how we can compare and contrast lots of things, like different points of view, different characters and their actions, different genres that we read and write, even taking a book and then comparing it to a movie or a TV show about it. One thing it made me think about in science is we use some text to compare and contrast points of view between scientists on a particular subject, and I'll actually talk through an example of that a little bit more later on.
Yeah, and in math, we already showed an example of how you can compare and contrast polygons, but also if you have a complex problem that maybe you want students to compare different strategies that they might use to solve this problem and create some great gallery walk of different examples of strategies people choose.
Oh, sure. History and civics, super important in helping us understand differences in time periods, differences in governments. We could take a continent like Europe and look at the different types of governments and how that might affect relationships, economies between those countries. So it's all over.
Yeah, even in PE and health, you know, you think about different plays that you might use in a certain situation in different games. You might think about different golf club you would use in different situations, which I know nothing about, but I would have to learn about that ahead of time. And maybe in health, you could talk about healthy foods versus not so healthy foods and the effects they have on your body. So it's everywhere through every discipline that I can think of.
Oh, yeah, that's a great example. So I think what would be really good now is to pop up the PowerPoint here again and use that to help us think a little about.
Okay.
And here we go. So we just talked about that. Here's what we'd like you to do is to think about when do you compare things to each other, to find similarities, to find differences, personal life, your professional life. So what we'd like to invite you to do as viewers is we're just going to go ahead and give you 2 minutes to think a little bit about this. And we would encourage you to jump into the chat room. And if you haven't seen the chat room yet, if we go to the Google site for the info MOOC, you'll see a link for a chat. And please, we had wonderful interactions 2 weeks ago in the chats, lots of fun discussions, really meaningful stuff. So we'd like to encourage you at home not just to think about this and list some examples, but then join our chat and talk with others and share some examples. So we're going to go ahead and give you a minute or two to think about compare and contrast and jot down some ideas, and please go to the chat room and share. And we're back, so thank you for taking a few moments to think about comparing and contrasting in your personal and professional lives. So we hopefully have established the importance of comparing and contrasting and all the work it does for us in understanding and making sense of new situations and comparing past to present. So I think what's really important to think about is what do we need to do as teachers to help our students think as they compare and contrast.
Right.
And one thing that's always important in all parts of education is going back to what is our purpose, what's our context. So why are we comparing things? We, of course, need things to compare to each other. And in order to do a really good comparison, we need to gather a bunch of information so that we have a lot of knowledge so we can be informed. And then I'm going to show you in just a minute what it means to find some meaningful points of comparison and contrast, and we'll talk a little bit about ranking those. And of course, graphic organizers are super helpful in keeping all of our thinking organized. And then a little later, Cheryl will talk to us about moving beyond the graphic organizer and how we make judgments based on the compare, the contrast that we did. So I just kind of want to return because I'm thinking again about spring break because it is coming up in less than a month. So, you know, first off, we had 3 different places that we have been to that we enjoy going fishing to and that we wanted to compare to each other. And then the meaningful points, how did we decide this? We said, what's going to make us go to a place versus not go to a place? Now, there's all sorts of little considerations. In fact, we could have said drive time. We could have said, how long is each destination? And we decided, you know what, that doesn't really matter to us. We're willing to drive somewhere if these 4 things are met. So what's the weather going to be like, the potential? We like to catch big fish. We like to catch lots of fish. Sometimes those both go together. Sometimes they don't. And then, of course, after winter, camping options, which ties back to the weather. So Lake Havasu, Arizona won this year's fishing destination. So, you know, just an example of how it's used, not just in our work with students, but even in our personal lives to make decisions that are important to us. So here's what we'd like you to do. We'd like you to give a try comparing and contrasting now that you've thought a little bit about when you might use it. And we want to give you a specific task. So one thing in our lives that tends to be different is a work day or a weekday versus a non-work day and a weekend. So I'm going to give you once again about 2 minutes, and we'd like you to simply make 2 columns, and we'd like you to list characteristics, so events, details, things that go on a work day versus a non-work day. And at this point, don't worry if you have some of the same characteristics. Like some things might be the same on a weekday versus a weekend, and that's all right for now. Don't worry about that. So like a quick example I had is, you know, on a weekday, I get up at about 5:45 a.m. and on a Saturday I'm going to go ahead and pretend I get up when I feel like it, which is usually when my 5-year-old and or 3-year-old come jump on the bed and say we're ready to get up, which oftentimes, unfortunately, is more like 5:45 a.m. But just to kind of give you a quick little example. So we'd like to go ahead again and give you 2 minutes to give this a try. Oops, wrong slide. And we'll be back with you in just a moment. So go ahead. And we're back, and we just want to say thank you. We've noticed some great conversations in the chat room, so if you have not gotten to the chat room yet, go to our Google site and jump onto the chat room. Cheryl, you were noticing one that was in the chat room.
Yeah, so Robin said something about comparing historical fiction with actual history that leads to real critical thinking about what was kept and what was changed when they created this historical fiction. And then also comparing and contrasting movies like The Patriot and Pocahontas, and so movies that take place near the same time frame.
Okay, great example. So here's what we want to do now. You have a list, and you might have noticed that your list has some similar characteristics and some different characteristics. So we just want to play around with how we can better compare and contrast and then show overlaps. So what we're going to encourage you to do is to now take that list and arrange it into a Venn diagram. So two overlapping circles that in the center compare your weekday and your weekend, and then in the two outer circles contrast or show the differences. And we did just want to show you there's a web address that you should see up right now, which is a great digital tool. You might not have enough time to play with it right now because we're just going to take about 2 minutes. But it's a fun way for kids, if you have technology, to build one digitally.
Yeah, it's awesome.
Yeah, so we're going to go ahead and give you just a minute or two to play around with putting your list items into a Venn diagram to show similarities versus differences. And once again, we'd encourage you to hop into the chat room and share a few things that you notice that your weekday has in common with your weekend, or even a couple things that are different. So we'll be back with you in just a moment. Oh, and we're both sitting here laughing right now because there are some great examples of Venn diagram gone wrong in the chat room, specifically Jeff lamenting that there seems to be a little too much overlap in his Venn diagram between weekday and weekend, which I think a lot of us can relate to. You know, we just want to touch base again about how important strategies and structures are for students. So, you know, one thing that we just did is starting off by listing, and hey, we talked about listing in our very first unit, and it really just drives so much work with informational text and drives so much of our thinking is to just start getting things out on paper. And then we took that list really, which was pretty unorganized, and we organized it into a Venn diagram. So we said, hey, how can we use another structure now to take this list and really show us overlaps versus things that are different. And Cheryl, I know there were a couple, or actually a new one that you wanted to talk about that's really good for younger learners.
So as a teacher who works with a lot of younger kids, including first graders and second graders, the Venn diagram is kind of difficult for them. For one thing, that little middle section is just physically difficult for them to write in. But also the idea of those circles crossing and that like area is just kind of abstract for them. So on the Make Bank, I put a few examples of what's called a top hat analysis. And basically it's shaped like a top hat, and it has the two, so if you did birds and bats, and so you'd list the characteristics of birds and how they're different on the top,
okay,
and then the similarities on the brim. And all it is it's just more friendly to a younger group of kids for them until they're don't have to think so abstractly. But then we've also talked about a semantic feature analysis, which I love, and then also T-chart. So all of those work with most grade levels. Yeah,
and a T-chart's great sometimes if we just want to contrast and say, hey, there's not an overlap in the middle, just put the features of one and the features on the other. So I guess once again we could say it goes back to your context and your purpose. Yeah, why are we looking at these two things? Is it because we want to see both similarities and differences, or just things in common, or just things that are even different? So one thing that we want to talk about now, especially if you're joining us for the first time, is that we've really been emphasizing makes. And really what a make is a project. Anything in your personal life, your professional life. And 2 weeks ago, we had people sharing some really interesting things that are going on in their personal and professional lives in the chat room. And so we want to provide just another little bit of think time, and then also some time to interact in the chat room and share, because we saw some amazing sharing going on 2 weeks ago. And if you're new to us, what we want to challenge you to think about is what's going on right now in your personal life or professional life where you could do some comparing and contrasting and look at things and look for similarities, look for differences. If you have been with us, especially 2 weeks ago when we had that really good chat room discussion, go back to that make that you're going and think about that. In fact, we're going to pull up a slide that might help facilitate a little bit of thinking about that. There we go. So one thing it makes me think of is if I'm doing a make, how can I compare my make to something else that has characteristics or features that I want to use? So how can I find a mentor make? Like I'm making this website right now for a unit coming up on ecology. So I went out and looked at other websites and kind of saw how do people organize information. At the same time, that allowed me to contrast and say, I don't like this website, and I'm not sure that I would organize my information. So I use compare and contrast both to find mentor makes and then to find ones to stay away from. So we simply want to give you a couple minutes to jot down a few notes and think about, is there something you want to compare your make to, or a project that you want to do that you maybe haven't had much time to think about? And are there things you want to contrast it with that maybe you don't want to use as an example and you want to stay away from? And of course, we really want you to jump into the chat room and share with each other, because there were some great examples related to the makes 2 weeks ago.
Yep, there were.
Okay. Well, we are going to be back in about 2 minutes. So please go ahead and think about makes a little bit and projects that you would like to accomplish and how comparing and contrasting can help you out. And then do please share in the chat room. unmute, yeah.
Okay, we're back now. I've been thinking a lot about comparing classification with some of the teachers that I'm working with at my school, and we're partnering together, just kind of talking about our practice, and the idea of graphic organizers keeps coming up. And we started talking about that. Oftentimes what happens is we gather information, gather data, and throw it into a Venn diagram or some other graphic organizer, and that's the end of the conversation. We were talking about that really the purpose of a graphic organizer is to use that information to make judgments or evaluate or make decisions on. So we've been trying to be more intentional about using the graphic organizer as a springboard to some other kind of project that shows understanding and meaning. So, those projects can be big culminating projects, that it goes towards, or it can be a simple reflection of, kind of what they learned through this process. So we're just trying to kind of intentionally push past the graphic organizer.
I think that's great. So it's a stepping stone, it's a tool, it's a way for us to organize our thoughts, but then how are we going to make judgments and evaluations and then carry that information further to help us do some work?
Because that's really the purpose of comparing and contrasting, is to give you information to do something, to evaluate.
I like that. So now that we've compared and contrasted these objects, now what? What are we going to do with it next? One last thing before we move on and talk a little bit about classification, we simply could not help but notice the Common Core standards that are met when you have students compare and contrast. And there's lots of different reading standards and lots of different writing standards. And we just wanted to kind of hone in on one example and once again share you something done in the classroom with kids. So if we're talking about writing standard 8 and gathering information from multiple print and digital sources, well, if you've got more than 2 sources of information, you're certainly going to want to compare that information and see how is it similar and contrast it and find how it's different. So on the bottom of the PowerPoint, it says character point of view, and this was something that I did with my 7th graders. We looked at the early 1950s and the race for DNA, when scientists were trying to figure out the double helix structure of the DNA molecule, the secret of life. And there was a little bit of controversy and some sketchy stuff going on. So one scientist did some really important work that some other scientists kind of used behind her back, and they won the prize, and the prize was the Nobel Prize, and it was uncovering one of the biggest secrets in science. So students looked at different documents and compared different points of view and got really, really fired up and made arguments and wrote letters from the point of view of the scientists about what should have happened, that maybe didn't happen, or in some cases that they were fine with what happened. So another thing that I'll show you real quick, we looked at natural selection, and we took this really famous example of natural selection about the peppered moth, and it revolved around the Industrial Revolution, and it's literally in every textbook that has ever talked about Charles Darwin and natural selection and evolution, and students compared and contrasted people who thought it's a good example of natural selection and people who think it's not a good example. So we had several different documents with a couple different points of view, and then they made evidence moths, and so they they did some evaluation, they did some listing, they took their simple list and made it significant. So once again, we find ourselves coming back to listing, and on each side of the moth, they listed the strongest pieces of evidence that someone might use to argue for and against it. So it was another example of comparing and contrasting information.
Right. Oh, excellent. I love that idea. I need to use that in my class.
Yeah, lots and lots of moths hanging on our walls for a couple of weeks. They had a good time with it. So. Okay,
so now we kind of want to switch over to classification, which compare and contrast. In order to classify, you have to compare and contrast first, so it flows right into that. And classification is basically sorting into categories based on similarities. And any sort of sorting or ranking activity is basically classification. So in our life, we do all kinds of sorting. We sort books, we sort any kind of collection. People sort into certain categories depending on the collection.
Oh, sure.
At my house, I was thinking about things that I sort, and we sort laundry. And
hey, that's glamorous. That's a lot of fun.
And so, basically when we sort them into my husband's shirts, pants, workout clothes, my shirts, pants, workout clothes, dress clothes for school, my daughters and my other daughters, with the purpose of getting those clothes back to where they need to go in the easiest way possible. And it's not glamorous, but it's classification. That's what happens in real life.
I'd say I'm classification challenged because it all goes in the washing machine in one way and it all comes out all mixed up together. So that's why I'm banned from doing that chore, and I do a lot of other chores instead. Let's just say it that way. It made me think about in my personal life, the weather's starting to get nice here in Boise, and pretty soon it'll be time to start planting a garden. So by having the seeds that I put in the garden classified by not only the type of produce that they're going to grow, but even by what things can I plant early versus what things can I plant in the middle of the summer versus what things do I start in early fall. So there's all sorts of different layers of classification, and not only the different types according to, you know, what type of produce we're going to get, but time of year. Another one that I'm going to share, I won't show you right now, but we'll look at in a little bit, is I'm working on this website that I mentioned for a project coming up about ecosystems. So I had to really think about how can I classify so that my classifications match the classifications we use in ecology, but at the same time allowing students to easily find the information they need. So it made me do a lot of thinking about, you know, how do you define and how do you put things into different groups, and, you know, what work that does for us as far as organizing information.
Well, I had a really interesting discussion in my class a couple of weeks ago. My 6th graders are working towards a culminating project in which they're creating a classification scheme. And so I wanted them to do some work with the structure of classification without having to worry about the content and whether they understood the actual content.
Oh, so like a little front loading first with their personal lives?
So I picked something they all know lots about, TV and movies. And I had them generate a list. Again, we started with a list, and list of any TV show or movie they could think of. And then they compiled those lists into groups. And then they took those lists and they put them into groups based on whatever category they wanted to. So they picked however they wanted to group them. And then they defined each group. And so when they finished, we did a gallery walk and put all the posters up on the wall, and each of the groups went to each poster and kind of took post-it notes and put their just their opinion, or if they disagreed, or their agreements, or added to the list, whatever they wanted to input they wanted to give. And then the kids shared, and we had this great discussion because there was this one group in particular that their categories were under 10, 10 to 18, over 18. So they kind of went with an age group, kind of. And then as the groups went and observed their poster, there was a lot of discussion about the category of over 18. And they had things like Star Trek, Captain America, Castle from TV. And a lot of the kids were confused, saying, well, we can watch these.
So definitions were different. Interesting.
So, exactly. So when the original group came back, they had a discussion about how they wanted to handle the group's input. And so when they presented that, we had an amazing, great conversation, and it came down to, they decided, well, this definition, your categories are based on your parental control at your house or the values at your house. And so what my parents let me watch is different than what your parents let you watch. So what they decided to do then, after lots of discussion, sometimes a little heated, but it ended up being great. They decided that they wanted to make their category something that's more universal or more standard. And so they put rated G, rated PG, rated R, and so that no one could have a disagreement with what examples went under each category.
Oh, so that's cool. So it doesn't matter whether your parents let you watch it or not. It is that rating, and that rating has certain characteristics. Oh, so some categories are more strongly defined than others, basically. And you have an example of that, right?
Oh,
picture? Yeah, let's take a look.
So here, this is just the poster that they did, and you can see their categories on the top, and then their definitions were on the bottom. And then all those little different post-it notes were different groups and their opinions. So that's basically what it looked like. They did the original examples on post-it note pieces so that they could shift them around, which was really helpful. So part of the discussion continued. We had the discussion then, though, if always did those categories have to be a universal standard set definition or set category. And they decided actually no, because one little girl, Camille, said that she organizes her books next to her bed table her favorite books closest to her, and then as she goes down, they're not her favorites. They're still shelf-worthy, so they're right there, but the ones closest to her are her favorite books. And you know, her brother may or may not put them in that same order. But in that case, because her purpose is for her own personal interest, that's the way she classified them. And so it doesn't always.
It goes back to context and purpose once again, right? Like everything.
Right.
Why are you doing that? And if you can define it and then describe it to someone. Ah, interesting.
Yeah. So I love that. One of the things I didn't plan all of that, but all the text types we used in that, and the argument standards and the speaking and listening standards. So it was a really fun activity.
Cool.
So looking back at the crux moves or the important moves we want to make when we are classifying, we want to establish a universe, which is the population to be classified. And then we need to articulate the basis for classification, which is the characteristics you use. So in my example, the population was TV shows and movies, and the basis was rated G, rated PG, or whatever they decided on. So, and another interesting conversation that we had was was that the categories needed to be mutually exclusive, so only one example could only go in one category.
Oh, yeah.
And then they needed to be parallel. So some of them tried to put this little category of movies we love with their rated G and rated PG. And so we had this discussion about how that's not a parallel.
It wasn't like a good fit.
Label. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, great.
And then the last thing, two last things is the categories need to cover all the examples in the universe. And then they need to define the basis for putting things into each category.
Okay, great.
Oh, yeah, so the whole universe thing, a lot of that was new to them, especially the universe and the being parallel and mutually exclusive. So that's why I used a universe that was familiar to them. Instead of giving them a whole bunch of new science content, I used the TV and movies. So context is important. Like for my laundry example, to begin, again, purpose. We always do our laundry in that way, but it changes when it's time to go on vacation, because suddenly I sort my laundry into here's one outfit, here's one outfit, here's another outfit, and here's the stuff I'm not taking. So because our purpose changed, my classification system changed, my sorting system changed.
Oh, yeah. You know what? That made me think of an example. I like to fly fish.
Yeah.
And depending on where I'm going or what species of fish, that changes the type of flies I bring, or I might not bring, or I might classify into one box for this purpose in this species or another for a different reason. Yeah. So really, as my context changes, where I'm fishing, what I'm fishing for, my classification schemes change. And I find that by the end of the fishing season, the flies are a real mess because I have reorganized them in different ways for different contexts. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and so, it's important to be able to articulate that purpose too, and why is it changing, and it's important for students to be able to do that as well. So because this is another powerful text type, it also applies to many disciplines. A lot of people think science automatically, which is true, but it applies to all kinds of disciplines.
Sure. So in science, it made me think about that, we classify things for a lot of different reasons, like a reptile versus an amphibian.
Yeah.
And ecosystems, like I'm going to show in a little bit, we're looking at things like what's living versus non-living in this ecosystem, and how do those things affect the world.
Right. Yeah, so, and like in reading or English, you can classify biographies, autobiographies, short stories, novels, or you can classify the differences between those genres, or like fairy tale versus folk tale.
Oh, sure.
So,
even in writing, we can classify writing as, let's say, if we're thinking about the Common Core, argument, informational, narrative, and then characters. We can classify characters based on things they do or characteristics like their attitude. So that was another thing that it made me think of. Right.
And even like in music, you can talk about different types of instruments. You can talk about different types of songs, genres of songs, and what the characteristics of each of those genres are.
Yeah, and you know what, thinking about like world civilizations and histories, I brought up that example earlier about how we can compare and contrast different governments, but then we can classify them based on what they are. Is it a democracy, monarchy? Is it a dictatorship? Is it a communist government structure? And then you talked about going beyond the graphic organizer, having that information and knowing the characteristics of those then can allow us to even look and say, well, why is there conflict between countries, or why do these countries get along?
So using that.
Yeah.
And in PE and health, we can classify types of drugs and how they affect the body. We can talk about alcohol, nicotine, caffeine, heroin, and talk about how those affect the body.
Okay, great.
So we're going to go to the PowerPoint, and we would like to do a strategy with you known as list group label, which is pretty much basic for classification. So what we'd like you to do is list 20 people that you know and arrange them in 3 groups, beginning with friends, family, and colleagues. Now, so our universe is a sampling of people we know. Our basis is characteristics for that grouping, and then we're going to define the basis for putting someone in each of these groups. So I did an example. So I just thought, okay, this is easy. So I threw together a bunch of people under friends, family, and colleagues, and then I got to looking at my list, and I looked at my friends, and I thought, well, some of those people I really don't know. And so like Emily and Suzanne, they are my Facebook friends. Well, so then I had to think about my definitions. What is a friend? So then I thought, well, I better put some definitions to this. So for friends, I put people I spend time with by choice and people I can confide in and want to go hang out with. For family, I put people that I am related to by blood or marriage. And then for colleagues, at first I had just people I work with, and I realized, well, I'm a colleague with Micah, but we don't work at the same place. So I added my people I work with at Thomas Jefferson Charter School. So when I did that and did my definitions, it made me change my groupings. So what I ended up with is I have my friends, family, and colleagues, but then I had my Facebook friends, which is different. Then I had friends or family that I consider to be close friends, and there's my list there. And then I ended up with colleagues that are my friends. So really, you can end up with all these different categories when you really thought you were going to start out with 3. So what we'd like you to do is pick 20 people you know, list them under friends, families, and colleagues, and add groups as you see needed based on kind of your perception and your how you perceive those people.
And just like you did, even break groups apart
Yeah.
and say, you know what, family's too broad or colleagues is too broad, or even friends like you did.
Yes.
Okay, great.
So we're going to give you a couple minutes there. We're actually not going to share in the chat room this time because we're going to manipulate this a little bit more, and then we'll share the whole thing. So we'll give you a couple minutes. Okay, thank you. We're back. What we'd like to do now is look at this list that you have, and we're going to think about a new purpose. And so, like we've talked about, your classifying depends on the purpose. And so what we're going to do is think of a new purpose and create new categories that you think might fit that purpose. And then pull people from the list you just made or people that don't fit in this and figure out which people would fit under each classification. So what I did when I wanted to repurpose my list of people I know, I decided I wanted to go on a girls' vacation, which I really do, and I've never done. And so I thought, well, who of my friends and people I know would I take on a girls' vacation? So I have my list on the left. And then I started thinking, well, actually, it depends on the vacation that I go on. So, you know, I could do a camping vacation. Well, some of my friends would never do a camping vacation, and some would love it. If I wanted to do an amusement park vacation, there's some people who would love that, others who don't like rides. And then the Mediterranean cruise vacation idea, I'm pretty sure most of them would just go ahead and go for that. So I notice on here, though, Micah, that our things are not mutually exclusive, because I have friends that would go on all of those. Sydney would go on every one of those if I wanted, or if I asked her to. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think it does get a little sticky when we're talking about things like this, like people we know, and then how those people might do other things. Because you're right, I can think of friends of mine that would go do lots of different things.
Right.
And so the question is, well, how do I make that mutually exclusive? And boy, that's tough. So I think it gets a little muddy with people and going on vacation, but then we're looking at more concrete definitions.
Correct,
so that definition is driving it, and we're talking about science, for example. You're either a mammal or a reptile, so you're not both.
Right, right.
Or, you know, we look at language, and you are a noun or you are a verb. Or back to science again, you are an arachnid or you are an insect. Or even in music, you are a trumpet or you are not a trumpet and you are a different instrument. So you're a woodwind versus, you know, a percussion. So yeah, I think it really depends. Those definitions can really drive that, especially when we're working with subject matter and kids.
So again, what we'd like you to do is think through a new purpose and create at least 3 groups that would go with that purpose and define each one, and then classify people into those groups, either new people or people on your old list. So we're going to give you about 2 or 3 minutes to do that, and then we'd like you to kind of share inside your class, inside the chat room, kind of what you did with your classification scheme, and then how your purpose changed the way you grouped people and the way that maybe you perceived people. Because, you know, you can think of a person in one way, and then when you think about them in terms of vacation, that changes things. So go ahead and do that. We'll give you a couple minutes. All right, thank you for your participation on the chat. It's interesting conversations going on in there. Micah, you were talking a little bit about this website that you had created and how both compare and contrasting and classification fits into your creation of that. So can you just kind of tell us a little bit more about that and take us through that?
Yeah, absolutely. And this goes back to, once again, MAKES and us being teachers as learners and thinking about things in our personal and professional lives. And so this one actually kind of satisfied both of those realms, because I love sagebrush country, and it's really unique to the Western United States, and it's a place where I spend a lot of time. And because of that, I thought about, wow, you know, we have kids who study ecology and ecosystems, and they come into me at 7th grade and say, yeah, we've, you know, done research about the Sahara Desert before, or we've researched a tropical rainforest, or we've researched, an ocean. And so, you know, I get talking to them and I say, well, what do you know about the world around you, where we live here in Southwest Idaho? And there's not a lot in a lot of cases. So one thing in our research that the students sometimes have difficulty is just wading through finding resources online, especially with the science. There's journal articles, there's research studies, there's some really dense stuff. So I just thought about putting together a resource that they could use. So I'll go ahead and show you that, because it really made me do a whole lot of, give me just a moment to pull it up here. It made me do a whole lot of classification, and the classification schemes that I used for this project had to do with the science that we're actually doing, and then extensions that went into things like culture and history. So on the website, on the top, on the navigation, I first had to think about, how am I going to organize the information, because I'm working with 7th graders, so I don't want to have 30 links on the top, but then I also don't want just a wall of information just on 2 links. It's going to be really hard to wade through. So I got thinking about things that we would discuss and use, like animals versus plants, living versus non-living, so geology and climate is things that influence the ecosystem.
Right.
Even photos. I have a ton of photos that I've taken in my time out wandering around, camping and fishing and hiking. So that made me even think about, how can I classify those based on science, like abiotic, non-living versus biotic, so geology versus plant life and animal life. And then I had so many landscape and scenic photos that I wanted them to be able to use potentially to just kind of experience the world around them, and maybe some places they hadn't visited. So I then took a classification that makes sense to a lot of us, human-made boundaries, so different states. So I organized information by that way. Just another example here, when we're talking about culture and history, there's all sorts of different information on here that's helpful, but I wouldn't want to mix this culture and history information necessarily with the videos, or it wouldn't make sense with the geology, so it belonged in its own. So just, it's taken a lot of work, and I found even on the homepage of the site, I've started writing kind of like some blog posts, and hey, imagine that. I talked about describing and defining, and we kind of went through, hey, what are characteristics, how could we work those into a definition? But then I also have things on here about salmon, and how salmon used to run from the Pacific Ocean into northern Nevada.
Right.
And then I have some information here like a welcome message. And this is making me think, moving into the future, how might I start tagging and classifying these posts as they keep building up, so that the information is easily indexable, and students can go back and say, hey, I just want to look at the posts about animals, or I want to look at the posts that might be up there about culture and about history. So I still have a lot of thinking yet to do about it, but it's kind of a start.
Yeah, I love that website, because it's so true that students oftentimes have heard of all the famous things around the world, and they often don't think about what's in their backyard and the really cool things. So I love that about all the pictures that are personal pictures that you've taken to encourage them to learn about that. So we want to think back about some of the things that we are positioning ourselves to learn about. So we're think of ourselves as a learner. So that was a great example where you wanted to create this website for use in your classroom, but it could also be something, a project that we want to work on personally at home. I know Mike is redoing his office and things like that. So we want to think back about our makes. So that, again, that could be something you've been working on, or something that as of tonight you want to think, you know, I'd like to make a website now, and look at Mike's as a great example, or Micah, sorry. So we want to think about how how classification fits into your make. Why and how could you classify? Like, for example, you might think about how you could classify resources, items to complete, tools you might use, people that you might want to get in contact with. Somehow that this project you want to take on or that you're in the middle of taking on, how could you organize things in a way that would help that make be more understandable or provide more meaning to it. So what we'd like you to do is think about that and share some examples in the chat room, and we'll give you a couple minutes to do that.
Well, thanks for thinking a little bit about that. We're coming up towards the end of our session, so that may not have been enough time to fully think about how you might classify different things like your process, your materials, stuff's going on in your makes. But we'd encourage you kind of as like your homework to go ahead and keep thinking about that and also compare and contrast and how that works. One thing we noticed in the classroom was Jeff said, hey, wouldn't it be cool then if students made their websites and Jeff, one step ahead of you, they're going to be doing that in the fourth quarter. And so we'll be able to use this as a mentor website when they move on to their final culminating project of the year and talk about that and how do we classify things and what links do we put on there. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, we're coming up to the end of our time here. We want to encourage you to go on to the InfoMOOC website, and there's a make bank that has tons of different examples of different types of text structures. And then go on to the community page and share either just thoughts you're having or questions you have for different people to reply to, or share a lesson or something about a personal project that you're doing and maybe how these different kind of structures fit into that. One of the things that I loved was that somebody shared a tournament bracket.
Oh, yeah.
Did you see that?
Yeah, that was great. I can't wait to use that in March, during March Madness.
Exactly. I love that about just being able to share with each other kind of our thinking processes and even examples or just questions. And
yeah, absolutely. So we really do encourage you, please join the Google community and come check it out and check out the Make Bank, like Cheryl said. And we'd really just like to thank you for your time and encourage you to share this. Everything's archived, so come back to it, use it in a way that will help you as a learner, as a teacher.
Yeah. And in 2 weeks from tonight, so March 11th, I think that is, Anna and I will be talking about problem solution and cause and effect. And Anna's going to share a lot about her make, which has been a podcast that she's worked on throughout all these weeks. And so I'm really excited to see kind of how that's turned out and what she's learned from that.
Yeah, the grand finale where all these structures come together.
Right.
So it's been fun thinking with you all, and thanks again for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you in the Google community.
Yep. Have a great night.
Bye.